Hey, welcome back to part 4 of rebuilding Linear's website, where we are rebuilding all of the amazing details of Linear's website. If you haven't seen any of the previous episodes, definitely check out the links below to start with part 1 instead of part 4, because that way you can build everything from scratch together with me. If you're only here for the code, also check the links in the description, because you find links to the GitHub there as well. First, let's have a very brief look at what we built last time, and then we'll take it from there. So the last time we focused mainly on the parts right after the homepage hero. That means the full logo section you see here, the really nice sunrise below, as well as these 4 tiles. And these 4 tiles all have their own animations, and especially, like you see, there's 2 empty tiles left. And these 2 tiles are the 2 tiles I want to focus on today. And one other thing that's also left from the previous episode is making sure that this behaves perfectly well responsive as well. Because right now you see if you scroll, the right side is cut off, as well as you see a scroll bar at the bottom, which of course isn't really that beautiful. So that's the first thing we're gonna fix. And if we quickly switch to Linear's real website, we can see what we'll be rebuilding next. The main things we'll be focusing on will be the top left tile and the top right tile. I think those 2 will be more than enough for this video, with all of the really nice animations and details that are included in them. This video will also be a little bit shorter than the previous ones, because I think the previous ones only became longer and longer, and I noticed that it takes a lot of time to make these long videos and also edit them afterwards. So by making sure that videos are a little bit shorter, I hope to be a lot more consistent with the videos coming out. Oh, stop! I said it would be more than enough. It was too much. That keyboard component took up so much time that I actually decided to split this video in 2. So we'll be focusing on that keyboard component, and in the next video, we will be focusing on the command bar. Sit back and enjoy this video, because that keyboard component, in my opinion, is again super nice. So let's do this. The first thing we're gonna tackle right away is this ugly scroll cutoff. I mean, that should not be there, right? So let's fix that really quickly. So if we open up our page template, we see that this section is centered by a container in the page. And because of that, the scrollable section does not extend to the full width of the screen. Whereas the scrollable section does have an overflow auto to be able to scroll it. So what we need to do is remove this container from the page, and then go to this unlike any tool component, or section actually, and then add this container around our main text, as well as we also need to make sure that we give this wrapper div all slides. So that's the wrapper that's around all of the different slides. Padding left of 8, which is the same padding that the container has. And if we do that, we see that the slides also move in by a spacing of 8. And if we scroll it now, we see that nothing is cut off from the right side until we get to the far edge, where actually I now notice we need to make this a padding on the x-axis, because it needs to be both on the left and right side to really look nice. So instead of a padding left, we will make this a padding x of 8. And then you see that it also moves to the left a little bit. The only thing left now is also getting rid of this horizontal scroll bar. And of course, if you're using this on mobile, you will not see it, because usually those devices don't show a scroll bar. But it's still good if we can get rid of it, because that way we know for sure that no one will ever see this ugly scroll bar. And if you didn't see my previous scroll snap video, then definitely click on the link on top here or in the description below, because that explains a little bit more in depth the trick that I'm going to do with padding now to hide the scroll bar. Because what we can do to hide the scroll bar is we can also add a padding bottom, or for example 12, to have a little bit of space. And then you see that the scroll bar of course moves down. But what we can do next is add another wrapper div around this scrollable section, and then give this height of 48 rem, which is the same height the slides have. And then give it a overflow hidden. And if we do that, we suddenly see that the scroll bar disappeared. And this is simply because the wrapper is not high enough to show the scroll bar. However, all of the scroll functionality will still be there, so you can still scroll it without seeing that ugly scroll bar. By the way, if you want me to help you more often with these really small tricks, definitely check out the link below and subscribe to my Discord, because for a very small fee, I'm able to give you a lot of these amazing tips. So next, I'm quickly looking at Linear's website because we still need to add the proper margins, also above the carousel, but also between the title and the text. So if we quickly check that, we see that the main text has a bottom margin of 48 pixels, and the spacing between the title and the text of the slide is 16 pixels. So first, let's add the proper margin to the slide title, and we can do that by selecting the text 3XL because that's all of the titles in this component. And then we can add a margin bottom of 4, which equals 16 pixels. And then we go to the text above the carousel, and we see that there is already a margin bottom of 4, but it should actually be 12, which is 48 pixels. So as soon as we add that in as well, we see that the margins are now also correct. And if we now switch back to desktop, we see that we actually made a small mistake because I added fixed height as well as the overflow hidden to the wrapper of the carousels or the cards. That also now caused the second row of cards on desktop to not be visible, because actually this should only apply on medium and down. So let's also make sure that if it's medium, we have height auto as well as overflow auto. And that brings the cards back on desktop. And if we go back to mobile, we see that we get the carousel. And if we look at the breakpoints between desktop and mobile, we see that the grid kind of jumps around. And the reason this is happening is because of the illustrations that are positioned absolutely, but are also scaled up. The best thing we can do is add overflow hidden to these cards that have an illustration, so that the illustration can never expand its parent. And that way, the grid will be put back into place. But looking at this third card, it actually doesn't seem to fix the size of the icon. And I just noticed that is because I wrote width 130%, where it should have been W from the start, because width is not a valid selector within Tailwind. So if we change it to W 130%, we see that the icon also moves around. The only thing left now is also make sure that the SVGs scale down as soon as they don't fit in the parent anymore. So to do that, I'm going to go to illustration, and it's two class names. The first one being max width full, and the same for max height. And of course, attribute should be class name. And when doing that, you see that the icon scales down once it doesn't fit anymore, and scales back up when it still does. Let's also quickly do the same thing for the Zap illustration. And when we do that, we see that we can scale all the way down until the mobile design without the grid breaking, which is what we want, of course. And that completes the responsive tweaks and finally brings us to the other two cards. Let's start first with the keyboard. If we look at Linear's website, we see that for this keyboard, they again created a super detailed SVG. So we're not going to rebuild this ourselves. We really need to copy this, of course. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Let's inspect this SVG and copy it. And then we go to our components, illustrations, I think. And then we create a keyboard TSX. And then in there, we export const keyboard illustration, where we paste in this SVG. And as you can see, it's again a really large SVG. And one thing that you also should notice is that they added a group with a data key attribute around every key. And this way, we have a way to target a specific key, which is what we need to eventually highlight specific keys. But first, let's add as in static. I'm gonna create a new component called keyboard shortcuts. And that for now will render this keyboard illustration. And this keyboard shortcuts is then added into our unlike any other tool component. And you immediately notice that we seem to see a lot more details in keyboard than we do on Linear's website, which probably means they've added another mask on top of this illustration. So that's something we need to check as well. And sure they did. again, a really custom gradient. So I'm going to copy this gradient and open our globals and also add in a mask keyboard, for example, where we paste in this mask image. And after we've done that, we can go back to our keyboard shortcuts component and add a wrapper div around our keyboard illustration, which we give a class name of mask keyboard. And we also should give this full width and full height in order to bring back the SVG. Next is a list of shortcuts. So let's first add a few static. For that, I add a fragment around the mask image because I need to have multiple childs in this component. And inside this div, we're going to add a few buttons. Because looking at Linear's website, you see that all of these things are clickable. So that means that, of course, they should be buttons. So there will be of variant secondary. Then in there, we'll, for example, add the create new issue. And then we go back. We see that you create a new issue with letter C. So we use the highlight component we created before for this, and then add a C in there. And then our button is still saying we need to add an href to it. That is because the only buttons we currently have are actually anchors. So we need to convert our button in such a way that it can also accept an on-click handler and thus also render a button instead of an anchor. So because we are using TypeScript, there's a few changes we need to make to help TypeScript understand that this button can actually either be a real HTML button or an HTML anchor. And thus, it will receive different types of props based on what type of element it is. If you're not using TypeScript, this is not relevant at all. But if you are, this is a really interesting piece of TypeScript knowledge to have to see how you can either make your button a button or an anchor. So in order to achieve this, we need to change this interface. Instead of having one interface for the button, I'm actually going to create a button base props type that actually only has the variant props. So the button base prop equals the variant props. And it should also have children, of course, because in both cases, no matter if it's a button or an anchor, it should have children. We're also going to add that in. And next to that, I'm going to add a new interface called button as anchor props. And that interface actually uses the anchor HTML attributes we added before. So it extends that. Plus, we explicitly set the href to a string. And why we do that is because we're also going to add another interface. And that interface is called button as button props. Of course, that should then extend the button HTML attributes, which passes the HTML button element. And then the key thing here is that instead of setting href to string, which a button does not accept an href, we're actually explicitly setting it to never. But if we're adding never, we also need to make it optional. So this way, TypeScript is going to know in a second that as soon as it receives an href, the type of the thing we're trying to render is an anchor. So what we still need to do now is combine this into a new type, button props. Type button props equals exactly what Copilot is suggesting here. Both the base props as well as either the button as anchor or the button as a button props. So that means that these props are always there, and then it's either this interface or this interface that's combined with it. And TypeScript can know which type it actually is by looking at the href prop. Because if the href is not there, it knows it's a button. If the href is there, it knows it's an anchor. So we can leverage this actually down below. First, I'm going to copy out these class names because we're going to duplicate a few things. And I'm creating a variable called cons classes. which equals the button classes. And then I'm gonna copy this part and we're gonna do a check here and then return the link. Instead of destructuring, which is also a key part, which I'll explain in a second, I'm gonna not destructure the href here. And then inside this if statement, we're gonna check if href in props and props.href is not undefined. Then we remove the href here because we're now spreading props and href is in the props. So it will still get the href. As well as we're gonna add classes on here. And then instead of a link down below, we're actually gonna return a button here. Because if this condition is not met, then we know for sure that we're rendering a button. And of course, undefined should not be a string, it should be undefined. And now you see TypeScript is happy as well. So TypeScript now knows if this condition is met, the link is always of type anchor. So the props we pass in here are actually possible. They are allowed by TypeScript. Whereas if we would not do that check, it would start complaining. Because the type, for example, it tries to pass here to the clipboard event handler, it could be of type HTML button element, and that's not valid. It should be of type anchor. So by adding in this check, TypeScript actually knows that only anchor props can be passed in here. We also need to add in the classes here as well, so we don't repeat that. And now, based on the fact whether we pass in an href or not, it will either render an anchor or a button. So if we go back to our keyboard shortcuts and then remove this href, but add an empty onClick, we see that we get a white page. And the reason is because we're adding an onClick handler to a React server component. And only because we're using React 13's app directory, that's not a possibility. Unless we make this keyboard shortcuts a client component because it has interactivity. So we can do that by adding useClient to the top of this component, again, which is only needed if you're using a React 13 app directory. And as soon as we do that, we see that our button hopefully gets rendered. It does. It renders a button. However, if we look, for example, at this button up here, we see that it still renders an anchor. Okay, so now it's time to add a few more of these buttons. Let's go back to Linear's website and inspect this wrapper div. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy them out. There's quite a few in there. And I'm going to create an array called shortcuts. And that is an array of objects with, for now, the text as well as the keys. And let me quickly fast forward this copying because I already see that this copy pasting will be horrible to watch. Okay, I think that's enough. Even if I add double, you'll probably get how this is working. So after I added this shortcuts array, we're gonna loop over them and render all of them as buttons. We added text in here, and then we add the shortcut keys in there. And then we also need to add a key property to our button, shortcut.text, for example. And if we do that, we see a lot of theme buttons, which is probably because we need to refresh. Yes, look at that. Okay, and next we need to add them onto one line. So we're going to display flex on here. And then space no wrap. And I already see that we need to add a wrapper div around our keyboard illustration as well. So we can give this max width of full. Oh, and this also brings us to that we need to give our card a max width instead of only a flex basis. So if we go back to our card, then next to the basis, we also need to give it the same max width. And it's also good to do this other card. Okay, next we see that all of the buttons are overflowing, which should become scrollable. If we add overflow auto and then add a max width of full to this div, we already see we're having a scroll bar, albeit a little bit ugly. But we can fix that, of course, by adding a gap of 2, so there's a spacing between them. And also give this a min height of, for example, 4 rem. And make sure that all of our buttons have a shrink of 0, because they shouldn't shrink down. And then we still got to copy in the mask that Linear adds around all of these buttons, which we're going to copy over again into our globals and add mask shortcut keys, so we can add that to our wrapper div again. Next, we also need to make sure that the scroll bar is hidden again. So let's do the same thing as before. We're gonna add another div on top of here that has an overflow hidden, which has the height of 4 rem. But then we're gonna give this one padding bottom of 8. Plus, we need to make this div full width again, so constrains itself within the card. And it should have been a min height instead of a height, because it's been a flex wrapper. So otherwise it will not grow to that exact height. If we do that, we see that we don't see the scroll bar anymore. And now we can utilize scroll snap again to make everything move. So if we add snap X and snap mandatory again, mandatory, then we can add snap center on our buttons. So this way, if we scroll them, they will stop in the middle instead of on the left, which we've used before. Now we have these buttons in place. The next thing we can do is also, as soon as we click on one of them, make them move. So first I'm gonna add a event handler called on shortcut button click. And that will get an event, which is a mouse event from React, coming from an HTML button element. If we click on that button, we first do an event prevent default. So the default behavior is not executed. And it should actually be a react.mouse event. And if we click on this button, we want to scroll this div. So another thing we are going to need is a ref for the wrapper, which is a use ref. And then we can set this wrapper ref as a ref on the wrapper. And then in our event handler, we can check if we don't have a current ref, we return, which only happens during the initial render. But if we do have a ref, then we can say wrapper ref.current.scroll to, where we're going to scroll to the left, which is equal to the offset left of our current target. So the button we clicked, but minus the wrapper ref.current.client width divided by 2, because we want to end up in the center. So we need to subtract half of its width. And if we now click one of the buttons, we see that it nicely focuses the right button. The only thing that doesn't happen yet is if we focus the last one, tries to scroll there, but it's just not possible because there's too little space on either side. So we could fix this by giving the last element a margin right of, for example, 50% of the viewport width. So there's quite a lot of space on the right side. And if we then click the very last button, it will still scroll there. You can overflow it, but it will always snap back because of scroll snap. And of course, we also need to do that at the beginning, because the first element is also never in the center, because again, there's too little space. So we can do the same trick for the first one and give it a margin left of 50% of the viewport width. So that way it jumps to the centering. And even though there's quite a lot of space again on the left side, even when you refresh the page, you see that it ends up in the center. Again, because of scroll snap. So it will not move it really far over to the right side because there's space on the left. It will still center it, which is really nice. Now we have the scrolling in place. The next thing we need to add is highlighting the keys. We inspect Linear's website and see what's inside a single key group. There is one rectangle, which is the background, and they set it to a fill opacity of 0.4 once it gets activated. Next to that, there is also a pod, which get a fill opacity of 1, and a rectangle, which will get a stroke opacity of 1. So those are 3 styles we need to add. But first, let's make it so that we set a class name on each active button. The way I'm planning to do this is take this key string and split it on every character. And based on that, we know which keys should be activated. So if we go into the keyboard illustration, we see the data key attribute, and it has a name. But instead of a name, for example, for the command key, I actually want to use that command icon, because this way we can use the splitting of the string. So in this case, the command key is called meta, but we're going to replace that with the icon. And I also see I copied some data pressed attributes, which I'm also quickly going to remove. And next to the command, we also need the option, which is called Alt. And we need a shift. And that's actually it for the custom keys. So I'm not going to replace all the arrow keys and things like that. If you want to build this yourself, of course you can do so. And since all of the keys are lowercase, I'm going to make all of them lowercase here as well. So we don't need to do any conversion. And then we are going to add a class name on top of our highlight and make the text uppercase here. But that also means that we need to have our highlight component accept the class name. And as soon as we do that and go back, we still see all of the keys are uppercase. So that's good. Now, next up is as soon as we click that button, we need to find all of the matching keys so we can give them a specific class name. So I'm going to add another ref called illustration wrapper ref. And we're going to add that ref to the SVG, to the wrapper of the SVG. Now, as soon as that button is clicked, we first check if we have an illustration wrapper. If we don't, we return. But if we do, we now want to find all of the matching keys that we need to highlight. For this, we do, however, need to have access to the shortcut text. So we need to add this in as a second argument to our button click. So instead of directly passing the button click here, we can add a new function that passes the event, but also passes the shortcut.key. Then, of course, we need to add it into our typed arguments as keys, which is a string. And then we should have the keys available here. So if we click, we see that we get all of the different keys. We can split that into individual keys by, for example, creating a variable called key array is keys.split, where we pass in an empty string. So this will split the string of keys into an array where every entry in the array is one single key. What I want to do now is turn this array into an array of all of the different groups in the SVG that match with the specific key. So we can do that by saying key array dot map. That gives us the key. And then we do illustration wrapper dot current dot query selector data key equals key. So this will then select the specific group belonging to that key within our SVG wrapper. So if we create then a variable called key elements and we log this variable, we see that we get SVG groups. Each G maps to a group you see in the SVG as well. So what we can do with that is toggle the class name. So we can then say key elements dot for each element dot class list dot add active. So that way, if we inspect our different keys and start clicking around, we should see some active, which is true. There's also a data active left, but that's something we did not clean up, which we did now. The only thing is, of course, we need to clean up the active once a new key gets selected. So we can do this by running another query selector, active, and then we need to for each that array, or node list actually, which has an element, and then that element to run class list dot remove active. So this way, if we now click the next one, we should see all of the previous ones, all of the old ones being cleared, which is correct again. So now only the one that's currently selected will have active classes. But of course, we still need to reflect that in our styles as well. And for that, we're going to peek a little bit at Linea's website to see what styles they exactly add once a specific item becomes active. First, we're going to add class names to our icon. And then we're going to add transition, fill opacity, and stroke opacity. And then we're going to need to add the fill opacity once the active class is applied. For the active state of every key though, I'm going to add a little bit of custom styling in our global style sheet, simply because it makes writing these styles a little bit easier. Otherwise, it would become quite messy with all of these square brackets and things like that. So we can do that by going to our globals, and inside our base layer, we can write our own custom CSS. So in here, I am going to add a class name called highlighted keys. And that highlighted keys will look at class name active, and then the first rectangle, which will get a class name, which will get a fill opacity of 0.4, like in Linea's design. So we can test this by adding the highlighted keys class name to our SVG. And if we now click an icon, you see that the correct key is highlighted. And the reason this is working is because this class name is set, the active class name is being set by JavaScript, and then we target the first rectangle. So if we look one more time at the CSS, we see that we select the SVG in this case, then look for any active class inside, and then for any first rectangle and give it a specific opacity. We do, however, still need to add the same fill opacity of 1 to all of the other rectangles. For that, we do not want to select the first child, so we can use the not selector to make sure that we do not apply these styles on the first. And even if we would use it like this, it would still work, simply because this selector is more specific than this one, so this would always have precedence. But to teach you something new, we make sure to not select the first child here. And the last thing is we also need to add the stroke opacity of 1 to every path within the active child. Oh, and I just now reversed them because the rectangle should have the stroke opacity and the path should have the fill opacity. If we now click around, we see that all of the different keys get highlighted. And I noticed that we highlighted the right shift key instead of the left one, but diverging from the real website, right? Why not? I don't know if you use the right shift key. I almost never. Let's also quickly add the right margin below the buttons, which should be a margin of 32 pixels. So that's a margin Y of 7. Then we have the highlighting in place. It's time to also make this animate automatically. So for this, we need to keep track of which shortcut currently is active. So for that, I'm going to create a new state variable in which we keep track of the current active index. So let's create a variable called active shortcut index and set active shortcut index, which will start at 0. And then we need to have an interval that updates, for example, every 2 seconds and goes to the next shortcut. So for that, we can add a use effect. And this use effect will only run once to initially trigger the interval. And from that point on, the interval will keep on triggering itself. However, even though we've specified an empty array, in React 18, this will run 2 times. And because we don't want to have this interval being run twice every time, because that would move it 2 shortcuts each time, we need to make sure that we also can clear the interval. And for this, it's common practice to use a ref, because this ref gives us access to the current state of this timeout. But it does so without us needing to specify this as a dependency. Because if it would be a dependency, it would also constantly trigger a rerun of this effect, which would cause an infinite loop eventually. So we can create a timeout ref, which we use useRef. And then in this function, we are gonna create one timeout. And then in this effect, we're gonna create a single timeout to go to the next active button. So let's first create a function that says go to next shortcut. And then I'm also gonna copy this out and create a new function called go scroll to shortcut position. Because this will accept the position, which is actually the distance from the left side we want to scroll to. Because this way we can replace our offset left with the position. And we still need to copy in our check for the wrapper ref. As well as I'm also gonna add a function go to shortcut. And that will actually take in the code we wrote earlier. So this way we can add our go to shortcut in here as well. And then we need to pass in the index over here. So right now we're gonna have to refactor a little bit because we expect the keys to be passed into this function. However, as soon as we are gonna use the go to next shortcut in a second, that will only have a number and we somehow need to get the keys from this button without it being clicked. So instead of passing this into our onClick function here, I'm actually gonna add a new data attribute where we're also gonna add the shortcut keys in. Because this way we can query it from the DOM, which is already something we need to do because we also need to get the scroll left in a second. So we're gonna add this function in here again instead of making our own inline function. So that also means instead of having our own inline function, we can add the onClick directly on here again because we only need the event. So that means that we remove the keys here again. And then there's one thing missing because our go to shortcut will probably accept an index. So that means that it would also be wise to add this index on the button as well. which we can get from our array. And that way we can get our event.currentTarget.dataset.index. Good thing to know here though is that everything that is inside a data attribute will be a string. So we need to parse this into a number first in order to have a real number. And looking at our goToShortcut function now, we of course still need to get this offset left. And we can get that from the DOM by querying for the button with this specific index. And we can find the buttons by querying the children of our wrapper ref. So we can get this button, let's call it shortcut, which is then the wrapper ref.current.querySelector, which should be a button that's the number of the index. So this way we only select one button with a specific index. And if we now look at the type of our shortcut, it's either an element or null. And that's because we could query something in the DOM that does not exist. So we need to add another check in here that if the shortcut does not exist, we simply return. And then we can take our shortcut and add the offset left in here. And because we're using TypeScript, TypeScript is telling us that offset left does not exist on type element. And that is because not every element will have an offset left property. So for this to work in TypeScript, we need to add the HTML button generic to our query selector. This way, TypeScript will know that what's being returned here is either an HTML button element or null. And the button element does have the offset left property. The only thing missing still is the keys. And we can query the keys by creating a new variable and then accessing the dataset.keys, which is what we defined down here. And again, TypeScript is telling us, well, it could be that this data attribute is not there. And in theory, it's correct. So what we could do is always convert this into a string. So what we could do is, if this is undefined, we will simply return an empty string. In that case, at least our code will not break. And to me, that's really a benefit of TypeScript because it's warning us that if we one day would change this data attribute, for example, stuff could break because we're then trying to run .split on undefined, and that's not possible. So this way, if we one day, for example, by accident, change the keys attribute of our data attribute into something else, then we will always have an empty string. That still, of course, won't highlight any keys, but at least our JavaScript isn't broken, so our website will keep working. So now we did this refactor, we should still be able to click a button and go to a specific one. Let's test that. Yeah, so that's still working. But now we have this function, we can a lot easier also create a functionality to go to the next shortcut. And to test that, we could say, for example, in our function go to next shortcut, we simply say go to shortcut 1. For now, we will in our use effect add a set timeout. And then we go to the next shortcut of 1000. And if we now refresh, we see the first one is active. And that stuff breaks. And that actually is because we're using the EQ, which should have been nth child. But it's good to know that this function is not 0 based. So if we had index of 0, that would not be a valid child. 1 is the first child. So if we're using the index, we always should add +1. So now if we pass a 1 here as the index, it would go to the second child. So if we refresh, we see that it automatically animates to the next child. And then as soon as it has animated, we still need to update our global state variable to set the active index. So let's add at the end of our goToShortcut function also a call to set the current index. So now instead of hard-coded going to 1, we should go to the active index plus 1. But we should, of course, not go to the next slide if we are already at the last one. Then it should go back to the first one. There's a really neat mathematics trick we can do. And for that, we can use the remainder operator. And that actually looks like a percentage sign. So if we, for example, would have 5 percentage 5, this would give us null. Because as soon as this value is greater or equal to this, it will go back to 0. So it will only count up until 4 and then go back to 0. Even if you add 15, that would still give us 5. And 14 would give 4. So we can use this as an input to this function. So if we, for example, take the active index and then add 1, but after that add the remainder operator with shortcuts.length, we will never exceed this total number. And as soon as we do, it will pass in 0 instead of one number higher than the length. We are now using a state variable here, so it's also important to add a use callback around this, because adding this makes sure that this function gets updated as soon as the active shortcut index also updates. So now this function is working, we should also make sure that our timeout works. First thing we still had to do is clear this interval as soon as this effect unmounts, because this way we won't have any duplicate timeouts. So for that, we can store this timeout in our timeout_ref.current. And from the effect, we can return a function that runs clear timeout on this current ref. Also, as soon as we go to one shortcut, we need to schedule a new timeout to automatically go to the next one. So that means that this line should be run in this effect, but also in our goToShortcut function. So to prevent duplicating this and, for example, forgetting to assign it to a ref in one place or having a different duration, we copy this out again and create a function called schedule timeout. And the only thing that does is it will schedule a new timeout and register that in our ref as well. So we can add that function in our initial use effect, but we also should add it at the end of our goToShortcut function. And then there's probably one thing remaining, because if you manually click a shortcut, this goToShortcut function is also ran. But if there would be only 5 milliseconds left until the next timeout would get triggered, it would automatically keep on going. So it's good to, as soon as you go to a shortcut, we clear the current timer that's active. And then as soon as this code has run, it will automatically schedule a new one. So let's copy this clear timeout function and also add that at the top of our goToShortcut function. And now if we refresh, it should automatically loop. It does so with the first one. And then it stops. And the reason for that is because this timeout does not have access to the current version of this active index. And we could add a lot of use callbacks and hope that eventually the memoization will work and that we would have the right value. But since we are using really asynchronous things with a timeout, that would be very hard to create. So instead of using a use state, I'm actually going to change this to a ref as well. Because with a ref, you can always access its current value without needing to have some sort of memoization or callback to have access to the current value. So I'm going to copy this and create a ref out of it, which also has a current value of 0. And then everywhere where we use the current index, we now need to add .current. And it also means that we can remove our use callback because there's nothing to memoize in this function anymore. It's always the exact same function. Oh, and it's also now telling us that we're using this function before its declaration. So I'm going to copy this and move it down. And then we also where we assign the variable, we also need to set .current equals the index. And also down here where we assign this variable, we need to say active shortcut index .current equals the index. And that also means that this function now is also always static. So we also don't have optimization around that anymore. Oh, and actually this should of course be a function which I by accident removed. And if we then refresh, we see that it now animates. And if we wrote our code correctly, once we get to the very last one, it should go back to the beginning, which it perfectly does. I think the 1 second is a little bit too fast, so I'm going to make it 2.5 seconds. And I also notice that there's actually still a few errors thrown by React because we copied in the SVG but did not replace, for example, stop opacity with the camel case variant. So I'll also quickly do that to fix these errors. Okay, and now that's working. The only remaining thing is to also make this responsive. So looking at Linear's website, we see that they actually removed the full animation and scaled up the keyboard. So that's also what we're going to do now. So that means that instead of always being flexed, it should only be flexed from medium and up and hidden otherwise. So if we then scale this down, we already see that the shortcut keys down below are gone. The animation though is still running. Plus, we need to upscale our SVG illustration. I think what we should do, instead of making this full width, we should only make this full width on medium and up again. And on mobile, we make this, for example, 200%. So this way, we again see that. So this way, the keyboard scales up. That does mean, though, that on the card, we should add the overflow hidden. So it also will not grow beyond the card. And I see that I actually added the hidden of the keys to the wrong div. So let's remove that and make this always flex again. And make sure that this one is hidden block from medium and up. So this way, there's some room for the content. And then you also see that probably we should also add a max height to the illustration. So again, on medium and up, it should be height full. And then on mobile, we can add a max height of, for example, 30 rem. And then in order to not have the keyboard be cut off, we should make sure that the illustration itself has a full width and a full height, so it adheres to the size the parent gives it. And then on mobile, it should be positioned absolutely because it's positioned in the top left corner if we look at Linear's website. So it's positioned absolute, but from medium and up, it becomes relative again. And then it should be top 0, left 0. But it should be positioned absolute towards something. So that also means that this card now also becomes relative. And then instead of left 0, let's make it left 12, for example. So this way, it's also inset a bit similar to the design. And because we added a max height to this illustration wrapper, but not the height anymore, it's actually growing beyond its current wrapper. So instead of having the height full only applied on medium and up, we can add it back to always apply. If we go back to desktop, we see that these lefts are also applied. So we should reset them on desktop as well. We can reset them by adding left auto from medium and up. And this way, on all of the different breakpoints, it now looks correct. Also, our current animation of the shortcuts is still running. So you do see some keys highlighted every now and then, but actually I like seeing that. So I'm not gonna add the condition to check the breakpoint and based on that either enable the animation or not. So that brings us to the end of this video. We achieved a little bit less than I hoped. I was really hoping we were able to build the command bar as well. but the keyboard had so many details that it just took up a lot of time. And I think it's better to split the video here, so next time we can fully focus on the command bar and also build it in full detail, instead of trying to fit it in this video right now. So please leave a like on this video if you liked it, subscribe to my channel, and check out the GitHub link in the description as well. And check out my Discord. And I hope to see you in the next video where we will be rebuilding this command bar for real. See you in the next video.